I'm Alexandra Vacroux, the Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, and I'm thrilled to be talking today with two distinguished scholars of Russian politics. Yevgenia Albats is a Russian investigative journalist, a political scientist, an author, and a radio host. She's currently a distinguished faculty fellow at the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Michigan. But since 2007, she's been the editor-in-chief and CEO of The New Times, a Moscow-based Russian-language independent political weekly that went digital in 2017 when distribution and sales were cut off by the Russian authorities. Since 2004, Yevgenia has also hosted Absolute Albats, a talk show on Echo Moskvy, the only remaining liberal talk show in Russia, liberal radio station in Russia. And she graduated from Moscow State University in 1980 and received a PhD in political science from Harvard University in 2004. Professor Timothy Colton is the Morris and Anna Feldberg Professor of Government and Russian Studies at Harvard University. He's been a leading scholar of Russian and Eurasian government and politics for over 40 years and has written many books, the latest of which is entitled Everybody Loses: The Ukraine Crisis and the Ruinous Contest for Post-Soviet Eurasia with Sam Cherub. Yevgenia, I want to open with you as a political scientist, a scholar, someone who knows Russia as a citizen and investigative journalist. Could you summarize briefly how the coronavirus situation has changed the political environment in Russia and the calculus that Putin made when he was planning constitutional changes?
Alexandra, thank you very much for your question. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this great event. It's a little bit strange that, we are sitting in different cities and, we're talking about yet the country which is several time zones from us. It's very difficult, to be honest with you, it's quite difficult to talk about coronavirus situation in Russia as Russia is just at the very beginning of the epidemic. Moscow is approximately 3 weeks behind the east coast of the United States. So we expect that apex will be in Moscow somewhere in the mid-May. What we know as of now that in each and every region of the Russian Federation, there is the coronavirus cases. We also know that in many regions of the Russian Federation, the social distancing has been introduced. But the problem is that we're dealing with an authoritarian regime, and as a result of that, as it was back in the Soviet Union, governors and mayors, they're trying to come up with good starts as opposed to bad starts. Just today in the morning, I had to edit a story from the city north from Moscow, Perm. In this, the story is about a local hospital in which doctors got infected, supposedly with COVID-19. However, their superiors told them to keep their mouth shut because I suspect they didn't want Moscow to know that they have an outbreak of coronavirus. So doctors kept treating patients while they had all symptoms until one of the doctors wrote a letter, sent it to the municipal deputy, and became, it reached the media, it reached the New Times. So after that, doctors were told to get tested. But what happened that not those doctors who had symptoms were tested, but some other doctors were tested who supposedly were healthy. And these false tests were sent to this special agency in Moscow. So this is just to give you an example, what happens in an authoritarian country where those who bring bad messages get fired right away. More so as the first, that one of the first things that Putin did after the outbreak of coronavirus epidemic in Russia, he fired two governors, governor of Arkhangelsk and governor of Komi. Why? Because there was outbreak of coronavirus in those two regions. They're probably very bad governors, probably no worse and no better than other 83 governors of the Russian Federation. But the point is that bureaucrats, as you know, you hardly can call those governors truly elected politicians. They're more as, you know, appointees by Moscow, by president. You cannot expect them to try to come up with some common good. Another distinctive feature of this, you know, of the start of the coronavirus epidemic in Russia is that Putin all of a sudden demonstrated that he doesn't know how to be a leader. Apparently, in these rare times when you need a state, when you need a leader who is to make crucial decisions for the well-being of the nation, which is going to suffer probably severely from coronavirus, Putin sort of disappeared. He already made, you know, 4 addresses to the nation. In first 3, he was out of place totally.
So how do you?
Also, you know, the last thing, if I may, by the way, you know, I don't see you for some reasons, but anyway, the last thing I would want to point out that this outbreak of coronavirus in Russia showed that Russian state is so deadly corrupted that it almost non-existent. Because in these kind of situations, state is about delivering common good, something that people cannot buy, cannot create, you know, about goods like security, like, you know, testings, like healthcare system that's supposed to somehow to deal with this problem. However, once again, we see that Russian state, it took it long, you know, several weeks to come up with a rescue package. It's still not clear how people are going to survive, as many people don't have any savings. And unlike in many countries across the globe, where governments just gave money to citizens so they can buy stuff and they can at least buy food and, you know, whatever they need to survive. Nothing like that so far happened in Russia. So that's the, you know, I would say, you know, the very preliminary outcomes of the very beginning of the coronavirus epidemic in Russia.
Oh, Tim, let me turn to you now. I know that you had been thinking quite extensively about what the proposed constitutional changes that Putin put forth meant for how he was looking at the regime and his future. Do you think that the calculus has changed given the kinds of weaknesses that the coronavirus situation has exposed?
I would have to think so. I mean, a lot of things have changed in the entire world that we live in. And Putin is not always quick to react, but he's not stupid. So I think he understands that a lot of things have changed. And if he could redo what he did in January and February, he probably would, but it's too late to do that now. So, you know, in terms of the response of the state, what Yevgenia Albats described is certainly reminiscent of the early stages of the Chinese response. When you remember, local officials covered up the first outbreak in Wuhan. But then, you know, China's authoritarian state swung into action. And although it looks as if we don't still have the full story, it does seem pretty clear that they managed the crisis better than most other countries, and certainly much, much better than this country, which is now going to end up with, 5 to 10 times as many victims in a much smaller population. So, there's nothing straightforward here. Russia's regime may be authoritarian if one has to reduce it to a single word, but what the question that Yevgenia raised was one about state capacity. And so for Putin to be seeking validation from the population at a time when that incapacity, in a sense, is being revealed by events beyond his control, it's hardly ideal timing. I also agree with Yevgenia Markovna very much that in addition to I would say more than the public health emergency, where you might say that Russia is not without resources, and it may prove to be, more effective than one might guess. I think it's the economic fallout from this, which is probably going to be the biggest disaster, aside from the many people who will die. But I mean, the effects of this are going to be very, very hard for Russia to control without changing some of its key strategic choices made in the past, one of which is not to dip into hard currency and gold reserves. So Russia has $500 billion in the bank, which they've been saving for other events, certainly not for this, but I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to start thinking afresh, because the little incentive plans that they've announced so far are just, they don't even get to the level of a drop in the bucket. As far as the succession, though, and the Constitution are concerned, so Alexandra and I were in Washington some weeks ago when the coronavirus was just impinging on our consciousness. We were in Washington, I think around the 1st of March or something like that. And we had a discussion of this question with alumni where the topic, barely came up, because it seemed, we knew what was happening in China, but it seemed like a long way off and it didn't seem that relevant. So yes, we might have mentioned it, but that was about it. And even at that point, it was very hard to figure out what was the key or the core of the events unfolding in the Russian political machine. And a crucial problem here is, and I'm just voicing the obvious, is that we don't know what key actors, and particularly Putin himself, really had in mind when they set this process in motion. So I don't quite recall if Tereshkova's, the former astronaut's intervention in the Duma had already occurred, where she said, let's make it possible for anyone, including Putin, to run for president in 2024. It looks pretty phony in retrospect, right? Does this mean that the whole thing was staged to bring about that outcome? It's certainly possible, but I don't see it. It's maybe even likely, but I don't see how we could know for sure. And I would go further than that. I don't think we have any way of knowing what Putin's general plans are. When I was speaking in Washington, I think Alexandra will remember, I expressed some skepticism about theories that were bouncing around that suggested at the time that we had it all figured out already. We knew what was going to happen. Putin was going to, he'd now decided in 2020 that in 2024 he was not going to leave power. He was going to extend his rule through this state council, which, remember, there was much discussion of that, even though we had like 7 words from the Russians describing what the state council was going to do. And I was dubious about that as well. It now looks to me as if the state council is, and we can talk more about this, of course, is not going to be a key to this at all. And if he's going to stay, he's probably going to stay as president, is all I can infer. So it's a mess, and that is to say, it's very, very unclear. And what makes it especially, though, has special potential for destabilization, or at least for disruption of the status quo, is the plebiscite, or this so-called голосование in Russian, which is not a referendum, properly speaking, but he decided he wanted to have the population sign off on his constitutional plans. He's now had to postpone this event, which is really quite unprecedented for him. And I think that I doubt it will fail, but I think it's going to be a much more complex process than he had in mind. I would just leave with this remark, which is really a question for Yevgenia. So if we look at Russian leaders in the 20th century, it seems to me, I don't see any exceptions to the following rule. Towards the end of their reign, they all mess up. So Nicholas II blundered into World War I. We know what happened to him. Lenin selected Stalin to be general secretary. He then changed his mind, but it was too late. Stalin was almost surely psychotic in his last few years, and he was hatching plans to wipe out most of the other members of the inner circle. Didn't have time to do that, but I think the revulsion among his co-leaders to these plans helps explain de-Stalinization. Khrushchev gets overthrown in 1964. Brezhnev blunders into Afghanistan and becomes old and degenerate in office. Gorbachev, of course, prepares the way for the collapse of the whole system, and Yeltsin selects Putin. So is there any reason to think that Putin, who has been, pretty shrewd over many years now, is going to end up, is he equipped to perform any better under sort of end of rule circumstances? So that's my question for Yevgenia, whenever Alexandra wants her to answer it.
Thank you, Professor Colton. Yes, Sasha, should I answer or what?
Please answer.
Okay. I don't think that Putin is going to resign. I don't think that he has it in mind. The problem is that I think that he's no longer in control, that he's very much dependable upon his close entourage. And in fact, there is a lot of tension now in Moscow with respect of what policy to choose, whether to bring army and constrain and to impose real social distancing. You see that all across Moscow, police is stopping people and trying to immediately to persecute them because they just 100 meters from their apartment buildings, etc. So I think that Putin is no longer the one who is going to choose his future. He is very much dependable upon his entourage. I also think that coronavirus, this epidemic, and of course, the economic crisis that in Russia, as in every other, in each and every country, is going to unfold in Moscow, as in Russia as well, especially because oil prices dropped down. The economic crisis will bring the unfold, the war between different interest groups. Already we see that there is a war between, so-called Moscow liberals like Sobyanin and Patrushev, head of the Security Council, and one of those hardliners around Putin, Patrushev, Kovalchuki, and some others. There is the third group, which is, led by Chemezov. So we see that there is already fighting, and if before they were trying to conceal it, no longer. So I think that the worse the situation will be in Russia, let me put it this way, that these under carpet fight will get more and more intense. I wouldn't try even to guess what kind of political landscape we will see in Russia by autumn, to be honest with you.
So is it okay if I say something, Alexandra? Yeah, sure. Right, and I agree with you. It does seem as if there's less restraint now about what you say in public, and Putin seems either helpless to do anything about this, or maybe, accepting that it's in his interest to allow it to happen. So in a way, the rebalancing of the leadership, mild as it was, and these very tiny changes to the Constitution having to do with the role of the Prime Minister and so forth, seem to point in that direction, a sort of multiplication of power centers. And Sobyanin is, I've always thought of him as a potential, Prime Minister. But he's been kept in the wings for almost a decade as mayor of Moscow, where he's done, in a technical sense, at least, a good job. Now he's much more in the spotlight as head of this state council commission on the coronavirus. But this is not to the liking of everybody, and it's perfectly obvious. Like, they don't even try to conceal it. So you kind of wonder what's going on there. As far as the Siloviki are concerned, I mean, a lot depends here on what you mean by entourage, of course. His man Medvedev is now #2 in the Security Council, a brand new position that was created, and is commenting almost daily now on the coronavirus crisis. So he's found a role for himself as kind of the system, moderate, centrist, or liberal lead now sort of in charge of the security bloc. So there seems to be balancing even there. I do remember when the first measures were outlined a couple of weeks ago, that at least at that time, and there was quite a bit of commentary about this, that the Siloviki, especially the security forces, not the army, were kind of in the background and didn't seem to be that central to what's happened. But that's changed in the last few days. I don't know, just having cops on the street separating people or checking passes mean that Patrushev is somehow more influential. I'm not sure about the logic of that, but in any case, they do seem to be part of the solution in a way that they weren't before. But the other thing that Yevgenia didn't mention, I didn't mention either, has to do with the governors. You mentioned that some of them have been fired. It's true. Maybe somewhat strangely, in one of his early addresses to the nation, Putin said he wanted the governors to take a much greater role. There couldn't be any one size fits all. Russia's a big place. The governors had to sort of fend for themselves. So even though they continue to serve at his pleasure, it does seem a lot of responsibility has been pushed onto their shoulders. And that's part, again, maybe of this sort of sharing of responsibility, taking the burden off of his shoulders and allowing him to sort of come in from the outside and make announcements when it pleases him. It might be interesting to consider parallels with the United States, where Donald Trump has now suddenly announced that the governors of our states are going to be responsible for deciding when to reopen the economy. But like Putin, Trump faces a test from society in a few months. Now, ours is a real competitive election. In Russia, of course, it's not anything like that. But there is always the possibility that even in very hard times, desperate times, that a leader who's not been able to fix the problem is able to rally, a certain degree of support as the captain on the bridge of the ship. And that's, I think, the role that Trump is trying to define for himself. And Putin, might be able to do that in the maybe 6-week campaign before the plebiscite, is to say, at a time like this, we need strength at the top more than ever. I'm your man, even though things haven't gone very smoothly, and fire some people and do some shakeups and do that kind of thing. Again, we're not talking, I assume, about him losing, right? But about turnout being low, about them being forced to cheat a lot to falsify figures, and it being a big mess rather than the kind of triumphal march that I think he had in mind initially.
And if I can follow up on that, Yevgenia, and ask you whether you think Russia does have a system of federalism, not exactly like the one in the United States, but still there's a difference between federal government and oblast, or the equivalent of state governments. And we're seeing here an attempt by Putin to devolve some of the responsibility, if not the authority, to the regions, so that they take care of their local problems. They determine, every region is different. And that seems to have been one way to avoid being responsible for some of the harsher measures, some of the lockdown measures. But do you think the pandemic is going to lead to some kind of decentralization process? Or
no, Sasha, I think it's very clear what Putin is trying to do. First of all, yes, by Russian constitution, Russia is a federal state. It's a federation, Russian Federation, that's the name of our state. However, as of recently, it's been clearly, it was moving in the direction of the unitary state. And all the major decisions were taken in Moscow. Don't forget that 70% of taxes go to Moscow. Only 30% of taxes are left in the regions. So you cannot really pretend to be running a region if you have just 30% of taxes left. So, but the problem is that in accordance, it's always been like that healthcare system always been the responsibility of the regions, precisely because it's very unpopular. Precisely, there I joke that in the poorest regions of the Russian Federation, the richest people are those who are in charge of healthcare system. You did your PhD thesis on that, so you know this much better than I do. So that's always been like that. So Putin didn't say anything new. That's why I was so surprised that so many people said, oh, all of a sudden Putin wants, he delegates some power to governments. No. He knows that they don't have money. And at the same time, he until very recently, he was very constrained about using, these hard currency reserves and the special fund that was collected precisely for the emergency like now. But he doesn't want to deplete the fund because he's very concerned. He doesn't want to borrow any money in the West because he's concerned that these will be politically motivated loans the way they were at the end of the Soviet Union when Gorbachev faced, the bankrupt Soviet system, had to borrow money from the West, and of course it was politically motivated. So that's his concern. He's afraid to find himself without money because in this case, he won't be able to buy neither loyalty of elites, neither loyalty of punitive organs, no loyalty of the rank and file. And he's only, according to Guriev-Treisman information theory of dictatorship, he's the source of Putin's power is based on the fact that he has had a pretty high popularity ratings. Otherwise, as Guriev writes, any general can come to him, any KGB general say, Vova, why do I need to listen to what you say? Vova, as he was called at the beginning of his presidency. Vova, not Vladimir Vladimirovich, not, your majesty, king of Russia. So that's, I think, that's the major problem for him. He is thinking about how to save control in the situation when there will be lack of money. And, oil prices, are below. Russian budget is balanced if the oil price is $44 per barrel. It's much lower now. And of course, there are a lot of expenses, economy is not going to work, there will be no taxes. State is to help other people. Look, in the United States, in Germany, in France, in Italy, state used approximately 10% of its annual GDP in all the support packages. In Russia, it's about 6% as of now. And no money goes to people so far. So, no, it's going to be very interesting to see how Putin is going to deal. He has to feed his wolves. He has to give them, a little bit of meat, and therefore he will have to make a choice between those wolves in Appalachians and people of the Russian Federation who are going to suffer. Now they're already suffering. And they will, I'm just, to be honest with you, when I think about what's going on to happen in Russia, I saw I've seen what is happening here in the richest country in the world with the best medical science in the world. And I'm terrified even to think what's going to happen in Russia. Because obviously that in China, where they brewed the DOS, as they do now in Kazakhstan as well, and people were dying in their apartment buildings without access to water, food, and any medical support. And of course, we understand it's that in China, that at least tenfold more casualties, more deaths than these has been reported so far. But I'm just
Yevgenia, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I'm gonna turn to Tim. Tim, you had a comment that you wanted to make?
Just about the governors. I mean, it's of course their financial means are limited. They have, if the center gives a signal that they're permitted to do this, they can actually add to their resource base by applying informal pressure, which is sort of how the Soviet Union was governed. So, the local Communist Party committee had almost no budget, in the typical Soviet region. It wasn't really about that. It was about the fact that they were empowered to use informal influence to fulfill the center's priorities. So governors could be a lot more influential than they are. I think if it was if everybody in the system was led to understand that the center expected them to be. It's also not just about money. Of course, Yevgenia was not suggesting that it is just about money, but it's just dealing with the mechanics of the public health crisis involves regulation as much as expenditure. And here, deciding on spacing, deciding on who has access to certain things. We even saw stories a couple of weeks ago about governors after they got what they thought was a signal from Moscow to do what they wanted, closing borders to truck travel and things of that kind, which is something we haven't seen since the early 1990s. Now, I guess it's not going to be long lasting. The Kremlin has quickly said you can't do that, but there's a lot of experimentation out there, I think, by ambitious governors or others who are fearful that if they don't do anything, that they're then going to be removed for that reason. It is interesting that it looks as if generally health questions are merging to some extent in the population's mind with environmental questions. I'm not saying it's a totally explosive combination, but the well-known controversy about what to do with Moscow's solid waste. Some of your YouTube viewers may be amazed to hear that this is such a big deal, but it really is. And this has been going on for quite some time now. It's stirred up a lot of very ill feeling in the region around the capital city, but the government's response was to then start putting Moscow's tons and megatons of garbage onto trains and sending it off to the Russian far north, the European Arctic region, where the local residents then got up in arms, and there was a very strong social media-based movement up there, which accompanied with some court decisions have really obstructed this plan. And it is interesting that the two new governors you mentioned, the governor of Arkhangelsk province and of Komi, which is a ethnic homeland right next door, both of the new governors have immediately announced that they opposed any expansion of these facilities. You might have expected them to say the opposite, but that's not what they chose to do. So the political ground to some extent has shifted. It may be temporary, of course, but things are not quite the way they were a month ago or 2 months ago. And we're in the usual situation of people who study Russia chasing a moving target, right, and trying to figure out where all of this is tending. You do your best, but 2 months from now, it may look very different. Unfortunately, I think Yevgenia is right that the public, that the disaster in terms of human suffering and that dimension of things is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. If they're 3 weeks behind, if Moscow's 3 weeks behind us, then their peak is probably another month off. But who knows what it is in Siberia or in the European South? It could be 6 weeks behind there, right? So this is going to go on and on and on. One casualty of this is well known to Yevgenia and others, is that the 75th triumphal 75th anniversary parade, the anniversary of victory over Nazi Germany in 1945, has been postponed. And this is something that must pain Putin personally as much as postponing his beloved plebiscite. They're now talking about doing it in September. If I was advising, I would say, don't even think about selecting a date now, because you can't be sure that September is going to work either. Just leave it open. But I think there are some people who want to try and settle a date in September, and they really don't want to have to postpone it twice.
So I wanted to follow up on something that both Yevgenia and Tim alluded to, which is that the governors are in a very tricky situation, right? On the one hand, they're given responsibility for dealing with the problem in their region. And this map shows the outbreak across the country. As Yevgenia mentioned, it is everywhere now. And if they do well, they run
What
the
is
risk.
the map show? The size of the red thing is the number of cases?
The
Or?
number of cases, right? So the top cases are Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Komi. And in Komi, it's been primarily medical workers. But I also have here we have the total number of cases in Russia thus far. So they're very much at the beginning and far from the surge. And then here's the summary data that we see. But I was saying that the governors have also, don't they run a risk that if they look too good and too effective, possibly as Sobyanin is doing in Moscow relative to Putin, do they not then run the risk that they're going to become a threat to the Kremlin?
I suppose.
Yeah, there is ongoing. There is already, pretty visible fight of Siloviki with Sobyanin. It's everyone is talking in Moscow about this clash between Sobyanin, and obviously Sobyanin, he's just he understands that Moscow is going to be the epicenter of epidemic, like New York became in the United States. So and therefore he doesn't stand a chance but to do something about that, because he was promised the position of the chairman of Gossovет, of this state council, this new body. Putin passed on him with the prime ministership, appointing some pretty technical prime minister. So Sobyanin was promised a very good position. So he wants to perform well, but he also has to somehow to deal with Siloviki, who don't, who very much oppose what he is doing.
So let me ask probably an impossible question regarding the Siloviki.
One thing that I want to say, that you ask yourself, Moscow saw Europe sinking into this coronavirus health crisis and economic crisis. Moscow saw the United States. Moscow saw China. So you would ask, why? Yes, it's the same question goes to the United States, of course, but since we're talking about Russia, I would prefer to talk about my country. So why they didn't get prepared? This is what I really don't understand. And my only explanation, to be honest with you, is because, they got to believe in the same active measure operation that they were trying to feed this frenzy to the rank and file when Channel 1 and Channel 2, the major propaganda channels in the Russian Federation, were saying that coronavirus was developed by Pentagon in order to kill Chinese, but they're not going to affect Russia. This was on Channel 1. And, when I saw Putin coming to the infectious disease clinic in Moscow and shaking hands with the chief doctor of the clinic, and he happened to be infected with coronavirus, as we got to know 2 days later, I think my only conclusion was that Putin himself, along with his, these idiots in the Russian Security Council, got to believe in their own active measure operation. And I will remind you that during the last years of the Soviet Union, KGB was convincing, put out an active measure operation in accordance with which HIV virus was developed by Pentagon, by the United States in order to kill Africans. And that was a very successful active measure operation which succeeded in Africa. So my only hypothesis crisis is that since, they're aging people, they got to believe in their own myths. And that's what happened, with Putin and others. That's why they didn't do anything to prepare for the unfold of this healthcare crisis.
Well, that would seem to be an excellent opening for the political opposition, to say nothing of investigative journalists like yourself. Do you think that that the political opposition in Russia is uniting over the effort to help society deal with coronavirus or to hold the authorities accountable? What have you seen so far?
I see that, everyone is trying to figure out what to do, how to do. There is still a lot of argument between different leaders. Obviously, people are looking for information. We see that all numbers of independent media went significantly up. Navalny each Thursday, he has his talk show on YouTube, 2.5 hours each Thursday, and hundreds of thousands of people are watching this because people are looking for some information. They're trying to figure out how, what to do, how to save their close ones. It's very, I'm so concerned. I'm so sorry for my fellow citizens. My brother-in-law passed away out of coronavirus several days ago. And, as somebody, I read somewhere that intellectually you do understand the disaster, but emotionally you start to understand when someone close to you passes away because of this COVID-19. And I know that, we don't know whether he was on ventilator or they just took him off the ventilator because somebody else did. And that's what, and this level of distrust in Russia and in the healthcare system is so high that everything can happen, unrest can happen, people may go out on the street just because, they will be dying in any case, and so they will be trying to it's going to be bad.
Tim?
Yeah, so I mean, these are all very sad stories. I'm sorry about your brother-in-law, Yevgenia. I had no idea. I don't think that political scientists have done studies of how public health catastrophes feed into political stability or instability. Maybe there are such events in the past, but I'm not aware of them anyway. And so this is going to be kind of a frontier for research, I suppose. So we're used to thinking about how, unemployment features into instability and how, foreign wars can impact and many other factors. But public health disasters, I don't think we're really exactly ready for that, but maybe this is going to be a new chapter. I mean, you could imagine it cutting both ways. I mean, the people directly involved are so absorbed in their immediate tragedy that they have no energy at the margin, unlike an unemployed worker who's healthy and who, is in a position and mentally, alert and all the rest to go to a protest on the public square. But, I would refer maybe a little bit back to what I said about this green side of Russian politics. It's not going to be enough to destabilize the system on its own, but I think there might well be a kind of fusion here. This has happened actually in some parts of Europe already. So green parties have really been riding quite high in countries like Germany. They're actually, get to the point of being really major elements in national politics, as more traditional parties fade, social democratic and so forth. So Navalny, who's been on the scene for a dozen years now, who knows, maybe he's going to be superseded by a new generation of oppositionists who are able to bring this into their repertoire of their critique of the status quo. That would be a very interesting thing to behold. I was going to say something else kind of along these lines. Yeah. Oh, yes. So it seems to me if you're going to get unrest and action in the streets, something symbolic has to occur. And I don't know what that would be, the death, something particularly tragic, but with symbolic value. So just like the falsification of election returns in 2011 was enough to trigger that huge wave of protest in the winter of 2011-12, for this to be translated into protest, unrest, and opposition, then it seems to me there's something is still missing, and I don't know quite what it would be. It might be local and regional and not national, but I think we should be thinking about that, speculating about that. I don't know if Yevgenia has any ideas, and what might it take to turn this sort of misery about the public health situation and its effects on families and households into something that is politically, energized.
Unfortunately, to be honest with you, Tim, I think that Russia will follow the suit of other authoritarian regimes, especially Latin American regimes. It is to say that as a result of, this health and economic crisis, these two crises, there will be split of the elites, and there will be some sort of a palace coup. Somebody will replace.
So you're thinking at the elite level, essentially, yeah. I see.
Yeah. Somebody who will replace Putin. So, and then it will. I don't see any good outcome of this instability shortly. I think that first it will go much worse. Some ultra-orthodox politicians like Patrushev, people of his cohort will take over. But then, since it's already will be very unstable regime, then probably opposition will have some chance. But it will get much worse before it will go any better.
The opposition, though, is also in a really tricky situation, right? Because on the one hand, the matters that usually activate them, like increasing pressure by the state to control civil society, which in this case involves quarantine measures, the introduction of facial recognition technology, all of those surveillance measures appear needed in order to help control the spread of the virus. So the opposition can't necessarily come out against them now, but obviously there's a fear that they're going to be still in place after the pandemic passes.
Right, but in 2021, we are to have parliamentary elections, unless they decide to election. So, these national elections, they always bring, a lot of attention from the side of the public. That's when opposition goes out and try to unite and etc. So I think that, beginning January, February of 2021, opposition will start preparing for the elections, and these may give a boost. But it's all, it's so early now to say, because the political calendar was pretty clear 3 months ago. But now, who knows what kind of political scene we're going to see in the autumn, when with all this, with the many deaths, unfortunately, and a lot of people on the verge of poverty or below poverty line. Listen, even in the in the situation of high oil prices, 20 million Russians live below the poverty line. What's going to happen now? You know, it's even difficult to make any predictions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the election in 2021. I'm sure they'd rather do without it, but they're more or less stuck unless they want to really pretty well throw the Constitution out the window completely. If that's the case, though, so the timetable is September. It should have been December if they hadn't tampered with the timetable the last time, but there's a 5-year term, so it's going to be September. That's not very far from now. Like you said, January, February, that sounds right after the holidays. Next winter, they'll get rolling, but they'll be trying to set the stage. They have to decide. I mean, Medvedev is still leader of the ruling party, if one can call it that, United Russia. He's, as always, he's done in the past, he lingers when he seems to be defeated. So he's, there he is. And Putin wants to replace him with somebody more charismatic. He's going to have to do it, fairly soon. Mishustin, the new prime minister, he may be quite competent. He seems computer literate, and he doesn't seem like the worst by any means. But the idea of him running an election campaign is a little bit foreign to me. So they have to figure out what banner they're going to run under and how much cheating they're willing to do. I mean, are things so dire that they'll go to pretty well any extent to come up with 49.5%? So I think it's going to be a bit of an adventure. It's going to be total improvisation, I think, until the fall, and then they'll take stock and see, so how tragic has this been? So come September, October, they have a few months to sort of get the ducks in order before things really get going in 2021. So it's sort of one crisis after another, in a sense. It's, maybe you remember the cartoon from when the sanctions were first instituted after Crimea. One that was very popular in Russia. It was Americans bringing. So there was a weightlifter on his back in a gym, lifting weights with his arms like that, and the Americans are coming from the side with more weights, more sanctions, and the guy on the mat, Putin presumably, or Russia, was saying, "That's fine. The more tests you give me, the stronger it makes me. It makes me even stronger." Well, I suppose one could say, in theory, certain systems do get stronger when they're tested. It brings out the best in them, and they move forward even stronger than before. Is that going to happen to this system? I suppose it's possible, but I guess I'm a little skeptical. And they're going to be lucky to get out of this, I think, in more or less the same shape they're in now, which is not the best shape. But of course, I don't know that. I'm just speculating, and this is something that we will see, and it's going to be very interesting. One other thing is there just another question, I guess, would be, we've talked about Russia, but what about the neighborhood? I mean, Russia is, its leadership takes such pride in being part of this extended region, the near abroad, all of these many integrated projects they have. What's going to happen with them? And is there any possibility that trouble in Kazakhstan or Belarus or somewhere is going to have feedback effects in Russia itself?
And I would ask about Ukraine as well.
Yeah, well, except they can always wall Ukraine off and say there are just bad people there. But I suppose, sure, it should be on the list.
In Ukraine, they pretty much follow they pretty much taken the same measures that have been taken in the majority of European countries. Social distancing, so support to consumers as opposed to businesses. In Belarus, Lukashenko announced that there is no such a thing as a coronavirus epidemic. It's nothing but another type of a flu. So that we don't know anything about Belarus. We don't know what's going on there because there is no information really coming out. In Kazakhstan, they have quite a few cases. Once again, we know that as it was done in Wuhan, in Kazakhstan, they brewed the doors of the entrances to the apartment buildings only, they did windows in these doors so people get some food. But I don't think that it will be much better than in Russia. The problem is that in Russian Federation, the healthcare system totally destroyed and absolutely corrupt. That's the problem.
And maybe that's true, but we also know that in Russia, statistics in various areas of health have improved quite markedly. It's there's no denying that. What the reasons for that would be, of course, is another matter. But life expectancy is much longer than it was before. That's a simple fact. And so some things, changed for the better to make that possible. Even before coronavirus hit, though, of course, because of the stringency since 2014, some of these things were turning around. So in particular, actually, my understanding is that life expectancy has continued to tick up without really changing significantly. It's more fertility and birth rates are already went down before the virus, and for sure they're going to go down this year, right? And there are going to be fewer babies in Russia 9 months from now than one might have expected. So, but it's like, of course, one of the last places in the world I'd want to be admitted to intensive care would probably be, in Ufa or Novosibirsk Hospital. On the other hand, it can't be all that 100% black, because there are certainly many indicators that over a 15-year period or so have actually gone in the right direction.
So we just have a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask you both, as longtime observers of Russia, what do you think we should be looking at when we're trying to assess whether or not Russia is dealing with the crisis effectively?
I think as everywhere, I think, there is one major indicator, that's the mortality rate. Look, Germany and South Korea are the best in terms of the mortality rate. Even, Germany has been testing 350,000 people each week. Since the third week of February, when they had the first cases of people infected with the coronavirus. These were people coming from the ski resorts in Austria. They tested already 1,300,000 people. The same, and the reason why it's so effective is that by testing people, they put into the shelter in place those who are asymptomatic, but who were spreading virus and infecting everybody around. So that's one of the reasons why the mortality rate in Germany is slightly over 2%, whereas in Italy it is 12-14%. In United Kingdom it is 10%. In France 10%. In the United States, approximately 6%. So, of course, the mortality rate, that's the most important, from my perspective, it's the most important variable.
It's the most important, but it's one of the hardest to measure if you don't know the denominator, right? If you don't do the amount of testing that lets you know how many people are sick, then it's impossible to know exactly what the mortality rate is going to be.
Yes, one of the way to calculate the mortality rate by, by how many infected, how many died. But also you can see deaths by 100,000 population. That's also, Johns Hopkins University dashboard is providing the stats as well. So now it's possible to compare different countries. We see that, for instance, Sweden, which has a very good universal health system, but they decided not to go with the social distancing and quarantine, and they have 12 times more bigger mortality rate than in neighboring Finland. So, no, I think it's pretty much clear how to define this.
Tim, you have the last word.
Yeah, well, this is a little outside my area, but certainly from a human point of view, who can argue with the fact that the number of deaths and per capita or per 100,000 should be our bottom line indicator. You know, in terms of how you assess that, you know, it is very complicated matter. We often don't know the denominator. What we tend to do in public health, for historical reasons, is to rely on census techniques rather than sampling techniques. And I think some of these questions could be answered at quite low cost by using samples of the population or samples of other samples. And this idea is now coming to the fore a little bit around here. But that's in terms of trying to understand the national situation and compare it with other countries. At the more local level, though, in terms of daily life and professional conditions, the fact that in this country, at least, we have so little testing that's gone on, I guess we're sort of at the same level as Russia here, is going to have a huge impact on the attempts to go back to normalcy. So at our own university, Harvard University, as they think about the fall semester, it sounds banal, right? But that's what they have to do. The biggest question hanging over everybody's heads is, how do we know how healthy these students are when we have almost no information about that? They would have to probably mount some kind of massive testing campaign privately to see whether it's responsible to readmit them to dormitories, for example. And as long as that's not available, it's very problematic. And if you want to make things even more problematic for everybody, but certainly for Russia, it's think about later waves, because it does seem pretty clear that there are going to be more. As is well known, the 1918 flu epidemic went through an initial phase, which was much like what we've been through. The virus went into hibernation in the summer, it came back in the fall, and the second wave was much, much worse. And then there was a third wave actually in 1919, which killed my father's mother, I should tell you. So yeah, so just think about if things are bad in Moscow, our topic today in Russia today, what's going to happen if there are two more waves? It's really scary on all sides.
Well, thank you for ending with the most terrifying and complicated point that we raised in the discussion, but it was an excellent hour of conversation. Thank you so much, Yevgenia Albats, investigative journalist currently at the University of Michigan, and Professor Timothy Colton from Harvard. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And Yevgenia, we'll talk soon. We'll talk directly by Zoom.
Absolutely.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tim. My regards to Pat.